Good evening, everyone. Could I get your attention? We are now going to start. My name is Mike Denkinson. I'm president of the NYU Alumni Association, and on behalf of the Alumni Association, I'm pleased to welcome all of you. This great turnout is proving to be a bit daunting for our speaker, but I'm sure she will rise to the occasion. So again, welcoming all of the trustees, the Alumni Association board members, other faculty, students, alumni, parents, and friends of the university to what is the 11th Speakers on the Square lecture. Speakers on the Square was conceived by the NYU Alumni Association to welcome our alumni back home to Washington Square and provide them with the opportunity to hear from some of the university's most distinguished alumni and faculty. Tonight's lecture celebrates over 5 years of extraordinary lectures, and the lectures are made possible through the generosity of dedicated alumni and friends like you. I'd also like to take a moment to note that there are a number of other alumni programs and events that the Alumni Relations and the university offer during the course of the year. Coming this fall, hopefully a date that you'll note on your calendar, September 24th, is Alumni Day, where hopefully you'll come back to the campus to share that event with us. And you can get more information on that event at www.alumninyu.edu. Now, this evening, our distinguished speaker is the renowned architectural and social historian Mosette Broderick, who is director of the Urban Design and Architecture Studies group at NYU. She's a clinical associate professor of art history and director of NYU's master's program in historical and sustainable architecture in the Department of Art History. It's a lot of roles. In 2010, she was honored with the university's Distinguished Teaching Award, and I can honestly say it was a privilege. I happened to serve on the committee that selected Mosette, and while I never had her as a professor, reading the dossier and materials that were put together in support of her nomination, it was truly a deserving award, and I must admit I'm looking forward to hear her speak, because the words of those who supported her nomination raved about all that she did as a professor, and most importantly, what she is as a person. So just a little bit of background for those of you who may not know about Mosette. She's a sought-after consultant and lecturer, and she's a prolific writer on architecture in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This evening, she will talk about her recently published book entitled Triumvirate, McKim, Mead, and White, Art, Architecture, Scandal, and Class in America's Gilded Age. And when I asked Mosette when it was released, she said it was released last Halloween. So I don't know, there's some message there. A reviewer noted that the book is a scrupulously indexed history that goes well beyond the famous architecture firm's celebrated turn-of-the-century achievements. It is not just about architecture, but about scandal and class. The firm's clients were the movers and shakers of the day: bankers, railroad and steel barons, merchants, and heiresses. They lived the life of luxury amid the industrialization of America as it became a world power and the societal changes that went with it. Now, art, architecture, and even murder. With such a mesmerizing mix, we are no doubt in for a fascinating evening. Now, please join me in welcoming Professor Broderick to the podium.
Thank you. Oh. Thank you, Virgil. Very nicely done. Thank you. All right. You're right, I'm daunted. So I'm going to keep going and try to pull this together. I've never spoken to such a large group, so bear with me. Okay, I want to talk to you a little bit about the architects McKim, Mead, and White. We have today in New York City something that we call, or in the whole world, something that we call star-architects. Star architects, brand name phenomenons like Paloma Picasso of building. That is a new idea. It's an idea that has only been around about 150 years. And the first really large brand name office in the United States was McKim, Mead, and White. They were the first large office in the world. They were certainly the first large office in America. They set the tone for high-quality building from the 1880s till 1925. Indeed, at the height of those years, the door to their office was continuously being banged on by young, ambitious architects who came in and begged to work free in the office to put a little gloss of McKim, Mead, and White onto their resumes as they went out to work in this country and even abroad. Famous English architects came through the office. All sorts of people wanted to be here because they were the brand name. What did they do? Well, they did the Heights campus, Columbia, Penn Station, the Morgan Library, banks, mansions, state houses. They really set the tone to give the first really comprehensive visual image of America as the nation prepared to take on its role as a world power. And yet, if we look back at the early lives of McKim and Mead, who you see here, we wouldn't think they were going to go anywhere. Standing is Mr. Mead, a good Yankee from New Hampshire who had no idea what he wanted to do in life at the beginning and probably never much through the rest of his life. He's the only member of the firm who went to college and completed it. He went to Amherst. He wasn't a superior student and he got thrown out briefly for deportment, which usually means he blew up an outhouse. He didn't know what he wanted to do, but he certainly showed no interest in buildings, in architectural solutions, in drawing, in drafting, in anything. He just kind of flopped along, following his brother, who went to become a sculptor in Florence in Italy, went there with him, came back, and sort of ended up working with a young boy from New Jersey, Charles Follen McKim. McKim came from an abolitionist background. His father, Miller McKim, was the second most important name in American abolition. He's the man who brought home John Brown's body, to whom Henry Box Brown came. He was a major figure devoted passionately throughout his life to that cause, which obsessed him throughout his entire years. And his son will go on to have that similar passion and similar fervor for being a good guy, doing the right thing, but in his case, it'll be for the creation of architecture as a respectable profession and giving everybody with ability the chance to become an architect. He was the founder of the American Academy in Rome and will become the dean of the profession of architecture. Like Mead, he didn't know what he wanted to do as a child either. In fact, his father must have been pretty unhappy that his single son showed no future goals. Didn't even do very well in school. His father, on a humble salary, had to manage to find a tutor to get him into the only acceptable school for that intellectual class in the Civil War years, Harvard. But he went a year late, and he chose to go into the School of Science, something they had there then called the Lawrence Scientific School, an incorrect place for him. He thought, oh yes, you know, if the word in the graduate is everybody going to plastics. Well, in the 1860s, everybody wanted to go into mining. He didn't have any ability for that either. He never showed any interest in architecture, never showed any interest in mining. He was a sportsman, a great baseball player, a terrific skater, an acrobat. He hung on a flying trapeze. He played cricket. He didn't do well in school. When he got to Harvard, he found that his natural affinity was with the classical school that he couldn't enter, and he couldn't enter it because he couldn't learn Greek. And throughout his life, he regretted it. He said, I know I would be a better person if I'd managed to learn Greek. He didn't. And as the year wore on in Harvard, financial strain for his father, he recognized he was likely to be tossed out. And so he came up with another idea. He would cross the Atlantic and go to engineering school in Europe. A little less time spent in college, a little cheaper, but going to school abroad was a very brave force in the middle of the 19th century. The boats were terrible. Most of them were strictly sailboats if they were cheap in those days. You got on that boat in New York, 30-foot waves, you had no idea what the weather had for you. There was no fresh food, there was no bathing, you were basically nauseous the whole way across, and many boats didn't make it. So McKim's idea of going abroad was innovative at the time and probably pretty desperate. He was saving his family from the embarrassment of his not doing well in school. Just before he left, he did have one high moment. He was a great baseball player, and he was on the Harvard baseball team that was a legendary team for 35 years. He's the tall man on the back right in the only known picture of McKim with hair. He gets as far as Paris and remarks on nothing new. Somewhere, just before he crossed the Atlantic, he changed his profession from engineering to architecture. Again, who knows why? No drawings, no interest. Where this came from, debatable. When he got there, Paris was awash in Baron Haussmann, building new boulevards, crossing the city with new buildings, accepting the modern industrial age. He doesn't mention it once. He goes there and absorbs the old. And for McKim and for his generation, in a new world where everything was new, being able to see things that were hundreds of years old was fascinating, and they reveled in the past, in medieval cathedrals, in all sorts of things that are old, whilst when the rivers and the parks and the lakes froze, he would execute a perfect figure eight, making him a celebrity of the ice skating flaneurs of Paris. When he came back to America, he came back with pretty feeble prospects. It was this city, the city of the high-stooped brownstone, a form of building of private row houses that Edith Wharton much decried. Not very exciting, not very thrilling, and not very Renaissance. What did McKim do? He built dining room extensions, bathroom extensions, and other such ignoble items on the back of the building going into the lot behind the house. Sometimes he got a biggie. He got to put a French mansard roof on a house. His early career was anything but magnificent. And when he got a commission for a house from his father's friends, who were sometimes now slightly better off, he built a rather pattern book, builder-like house, a house in the country, not a country house. Now, when you take a look at these two works, are you thinking these guys are going to go on to become great architects? No way. It involves the help of a man in the office. And in the 1870s, somehow, McKim and Mead found Joseph Morrell Wells, a gifted, intuitive, natural architect. A poor boy from Boston, never able to have a correct education. He went to work probably as an office boy in an architect's office, but showed such talent. Wells saw buildings, thought buildings. He saw proportion. He saw color in materials. He saw roof lines. He saw the effect of light and shadow on windows and doors and the proportion to get them right. And he comes to work for McKim and Mead, probably as an hourly employee, somewhere in the later 1870s and basically cleans up their act. He pulls together in what was a tiny little office the jobs they're doing and makes them better. The office was so small you tripped over each other anyway, so a little help could be well appreciated. And while he was there, having never been abroad at that point, he made huge renderings of Italian palazzi based on Letarwi, based on a woodcut book produced by a Frenchman who lived in Rome. And he created what are probably the first real large architectural renderings made by an American in America. And he brought them to McKim. And he brought them to me, and he said, look at the cool intellect of Italian palaces. And they said, basically, go away and help us with the buildings we're doing. And what he did was give some of their urban architecture some coherence, broke away from the brownstone front, new materials, new forms. And with their houses in the country, he wove them together. He balanced them. He put that Norman turret right over there in the corner, but he balanced it off with a double porch over here, a double porch to catch the breezes, replete with columns that support it that are bamboo trees. Wells gave design to McKim and Mead. He worked sometimes feverishly, always thinking of only buildings. Well, he liked birds, he was into birds, and music, but that was about it. And it was said that if he was having a bad day thinking of a solution, he would go to the windows of their tiny little offices at 57 Broadway with his chenille monkey. He had a chenille monkey on a string. And he would dangle the monkey out the window for days on end, causing people to think his sanity was departing. But he was thinking of a solution to a difficult problem. And when the idea hit him, he'd jump up, pull the monkey up, run to the desk, and produce a building. And one of the buildings he produced is this one. In the early 1880s, McKim's former brother-in-law, a German-born immigrant who came as an idealistic abolitionist but caught railroad fever, a man called Henry Villard, came to McKim to build a big powerhouse to impress investors in his fledgling railroads going up to the Pacific Northwest. The Vanderbilts, who'd put together New York Central, had a big block-long house just a block to the west. Surely if he produced a full block house, people would come and invest in his railroad, just as J.P. Morgan had got people to put together New York Central. Initially, McKim was doing the job, and it was going to be a big, bulky building, much like that row house in New York I showed you a few minutes ago. But McKim got called away, and Mead said to Villard, look, the talent in the office is Joe Wells. Talk to him. And Villard was a kind of pretentious soul. I always think he must have been pretty unhappy with the thought of working with an office draftsman, not a partner, but he agreed to it. And somehow, Wells was able to convince him that the Italian Renaissance done properly, done with the proportions of Italy, done as he'd done in those great renderings, was the proper thing to make Villard look like an educated, erudite robber baron, not a crass, new-moneyed Vanderbilt. And he did so by literally reminding Villard that the homes of the Frankfurt bankers, who Villard was turning to for money, were very much in this fashion, the palace of the Turnataxis. And so Villard agreed. And Joe Wells created the first accurate Renaissance building in New York, this set of 6 row houses built for Henry Villard. When the buildings were finished, he turned to McKim and Mead and said, let me show you around these buildings. What do you think? And they said, couldn't be less interested. 2 years later, a Bostonian who was in charge of the big public library commission in Boston came by and walked by the Villard houses, admiring them as he often did. And he decided to pay a call on a Saturday afternoon and found McKim at home on 35th Street and knocked at his door and said, Mr. McKim, I loved the work you did at the Villard houses. And I could imagine Mr. McKim went, great job, huh? He had nothing to do with it. But the fact that Mr. Abbott from Boston wanted them to do the public library, a big lucrative commission. How could you do better than that? And so what Joe Wells did is teach McKim and Mead, and indeed the firm, that turning for European precedent, but building it in an American way with the things Americans need, that will give you a good future. And it did. The problem is, Wells also gave them the poison pill. If they were too busy and couldn't be bothered to work on an individual commission for a lesser job, and nobody good in the office was there to do it, they would just copy something from a book. So he was both the transformer and the provider of a sad legacy in the 1920s for McKim and Mead. The firm used him and used him up. This is an interior from the wonderful First Plaza Hotel on the site of our Plaza Hotel, which Wells did with great aplomb. They kept him going like mad, and this provided a slight problem when the only New Yorker of the firm came aboard. This is Stanford White, a young man whose father was an alumni of this school, class of 1839. His father came from the old merchants of the port class, but unfortunately, his father's father went bankrupt in the early 1840s, as so many of those merchants did. And Richard Grant White found himself nouveau poor, something he never got over. He was tall, distinguished, knew all about the opera, was a great Shakespeare scholar, was a writer, a thinker, a musician. He was a cultured, cultivated, self-important narcissist who never got over his fall from glory. Unlike Miller and McKim, who worked to help his troubled son, Richard White did nothing for his son. In fact, his son actually went to a ward school, public school, very under status for White's family level. What he did to disguise this was move them out to Brooklyn, where surely nobody would ever find out. At 16, Stanford White left school. He didn't even do high school, to go to work in an architect's office, probably as a paid office boy. But he had talent. Unlike McKim and Mead, his partners, his future partners, he did draw very well. He did think about buildings. He did think about culverts to keep buildings from flooding. It is said that he was an eye, rather like the painter Monet, a great eye. He thought about design, maybe not architecture, but he thought about design. And he loved visual effects. It's said that if there was a lovely sunset, he'd drop what he was doing, run and grab some charcoal, run and grab some pastels, grab a notebook and go to the top of a building. And this is a counting house at South Street Seaport. And what I think he's doing is just what they described, going to the roof and drawing the sunset. When he came back from his initial trip to Europe as a poor young man, McKim and Mead decided that they could offer him a partnership because, unlike the two of them, he could draw like a house afire, and he was willing to do interiors. McKim and Mead, no talent there. White was willing to do with interiors and women who had an annoying habit of wanting to have bathrooms and closets. And in his early days, his specialty was additions and decorative work inside a house. Now, this is a wonderful house extant for us in Newport. You can visit it, King's Coat. It's a house done by Richard Upjohn, architect of Trinity Church. He did it for a family. It was one of the first cottages there. But in the early 1880s, the family decided they would entertain on a better scale. And so they had Stanford White do an addition. And he did an addition just as everybody did in that time. He made the addition look exactly like the house, so you wouldn't even know it was an addition, down to those wooden brown drip moldings over the window. Not in his style, but in the past style. But it's the interiors that he made special. These interiors are something that Stanford White does with superior ability. He is surely the best interior designer of America in the 1880s. What he does is specialize in unusual materials, unusual textures, unusual colors. He makes something new that nobody is doing anywhere else. This isn't high-style Paris. It isn't high-style Rome. It isn't high-style London. It's Stanford White. In this case, what he's working with is a family who were like his grandparents, merchants of the port. That means they had the mandatory, every merchant of the port bought a Satin Domingan mahogany table. There it is. Everybody had that Ray-Poussé silver from Baltimore on their tables. And what he does in this house is even throw in a colonial chair and that symbol that you're an old family in America, as lots of new families are getting rich. So you've got to distinguish yourself, and you do this by having a large spinning wheel, which is right behind the colonial chair. What White does with it that makes it new is the setting. He uses cork. Why cork? No Portuguese Board of Trade there then. No need for silencing any noise. There wasn't much. It's because it's a dull, flat, beige surface. And he puts it together with brick and forms the ceiling and the frieze, and he makes a remarkable interior. An interior that has to be a lot of fun, because during the summer when this house was in use, you would have had to have eaten every meal in that dining room. Restaurants were not appropriate for gentry. In a restaurant, you could be sitting at a table next to an immigrant. So you had to eat at home. Boring, same room. So what does Stanford White do here? Working with a young Louis Kupfer Tiffany, who was still then willing to work on design projects, he made 2 large window lights of blue block glass. And what that does is allow light to be transformed as it comes through the room. So it's bright in the morning, brighter at lunch, and at dinner time it's smoky blue. So what he's able to do here is create an entire new environment for a group of people who will rather quickly leave him. White does not work for the old families. White's specialty, starting now, will be new families. Families without the furniture, families without the silver, new families who wanted an unusual interior. Why did they turn to White? Well, look what the competition was. This is the large ballroom behind Mrs. Astor's house at 34th Street and 5th Avenue. Done by Mrs. Astor without the benefit of any particularly good interior designer. In that room, busy as it is, with the mandatory potted palm, the round bench, and pictures bought in about an hour and a half, she could remove them, put them away, and then the room would hold 400 people, thus giving rise to New York City's first social group, the patriarchs, who were 400, because that's all that would fit in a room. Stanford White rather quickly started working for the new money like new railroad barons. This is Victor Newcomb in a popular resort for railroad men in the middle of the 19th century, Elberon, New Jersey, a place that has totally torn down every single one of its marvelous houses, summer homes of presidents, General Grant, all sorts of people. Here, they tore down everything. There's still a sign, Summer Home of Presidents. Unfortunately, none of the buildings are there. This was a great building for Victor Newcomb, Louisville railroad man, using those same motifs. Normandy, the little tower over here, staircase, huge double porches so that you can catch the summer breezes, because the problem in these houses was to keep cool in a pre-air conditioned time. So the interiors are arranged in a way to allow breezes and mixing of people. This is the interior here of the Newcomb House. I really love it. I think it's Stanford White at its very best. It is a proto-loft. It is a huge open space. It's really 2 rooms. You can see that because the ceiling beams go in different directions. But he left out the wall. The idea was that the air came through. There are lots of little nooks and crannies put together with latticework screens, wicker furniture, a fireplace over here with Celtic brick, and the mandatory now cork and brick floor. It's decorated with the only thing the poor young Stanford White brought back from his first trip abroad, a few tiles and Oriental rugs or Middle Eastern rugs. He loved them. He said he would buy them from under the bottoms of the praying Turks. And he bought that rug and sold it to Victor Newcomb. And aligned with it over here, as you can see, is the signature gesture of Stanford White throughout his entire decorative arts career. He wasn't the only one to do it, but he loved polar bears flattened by a 10-ton truck with just the head in gear. That polar bear rug will appear in even his very last works. Okay, so Victor Newcomb had nothing. He didn't have any old furniture. So Stanford White made something totally new, something different, paintings on easels, funny little figures on little sort of half angel-like female figures on pedestals also. And over here, my personal favorite, just above the wicker chair, that is a ceramic dragon with a pagoda on its back. Would we say that this was great design? Well, for the time period, it was new, it was different, it wasn't derivative. He gave everything new a sense of being different for the client who would have loved the house. Unfortunately, early Stanford White, all his great interiors are just about gone, except for this one. He got a neat job working with Tiffany and the Associated Artists at the Society Regiment, still luckily with us, at 67th Street and Park Avenue, where he was to do some of the great rooms. And what is an armory for? Nasty stuff, stuff you use to go out in war, stuff that you use to kill or defend yourself. Not exactly a happy topic to use as a decorative motif. So what does White do? With a little caging from Tiffany and turquoise over here, he takes the colors of bullets and munitions, but doesn't make them look like bullets and munitions. He uses the colors and he puts them together in an inventive way with all sorts of strange motifs and colors and interlace and silver, and he makes this room really different, really unusual. This is high-grade talent, and thank heaven we are able to enjoy it. It's nearly restored, and you can see it at the 7th Regiment Armory. By the middle of the 1880s, things are changing. Boats are getting better and bigger. People are starting to go abroad. People are feeling richer and making more money and wanting to show off a little bit more. And Stanford White has learned the most important thing an architect can learn: marry rich. And what he's done is marry a woman who was to become one of the richest. Didn't happen. But in any case, that looked good for the time. And so he starts to work and to do a specialty that McKimmey and White will indeed engage in, and that is the building of clubs. What are clubs? They're places where you go and other people can't, right? They're based on the idea in Britain that arises in the late 18th century of the gentleman's club. A gentleman in England would go to a club that was placed in what had been once a private house, and it identified you. It summed you up. You were a traveler. You were an intellectual. You were a grand family. Each one had its own club. In the early 19th century, some of these clubmen began to build purpose-built clubs. The wonderful club still extant in Pall Mall. In the early 1840s, we began to think in terms of clubs too, but we sort of limped to them. We built them in brownstones. They didn't work too well. A good example of a brownstone converted to the club and extant is this one. This is the Players Club, built by Edwin Booth, an actor, family of actors. Went through life with that or went through his last 20 years at least, with that unfortunate approbation on his back, a brother of a mass murderer, or of Lincoln's murderer. A pretty rough way to live. And so what Booth did was decide that actors, unlike today when they're celebrities, actors were pariah in the 19th century, couldn't be buried. You remember that church? If somebody died as an actor, they had to be buried in that little church around the corner that did that sort of thing. And so Booth decided in his old age he would give over his brownstone row house in Gramercy Park, still extant, as a players' club to help actors slightly down in their luck. And what Stanford White does here that's quite remarkable, actually Wells did it, is remove the stoop. So this is probably the first stoop removal in New York City. And what he gives instead is a double-decker porch so that it looks like an institutional building, even though it's in a regular brownstone row house. Clubs are beginning to proliferate in New York. And there's a humongous battle between the people who belong to the clubs, the old members, who are used to clubs being in houses, even if the men's rooms are little booths pinned directly to the dining room. But they like them because they're downtown, they're inexpensive, they're familiar, the dues are tolerable. But there are all these new people coming into the city, and they want to join the clubs, and they live uptown, and they have a lot more money. And the clubs in the late 1880s go into a schism with the old members of the club saying, don't change anything. And the new members saying, we want to go to the club, and we want a big one, and we want a purpose-built club, and we want it uptown where we live. And they won. A lot of buildings were rebuilt as clubhouses uptown, and many by McKim, Mead, and White. This is a venerable New York City institution. This is the Century Association, the second oldest club in the city, a club that goes back to 1847 with a rather clever idea. Artists were underemployed. To be kind, new money might want a picture, so the club was open to artists and patrons. It was in a series of row houses. In the 1860s, Richard Grant White, Stanford's father, that narcissistic fop, decided the Century was good enough for him. And so he pronounced himself open to being a member, went up for membership, and was absolutely blackballed by everybody, and never got over it. In the late 1870s, McKim and Mead and the young White joined every club they could get their hands on. In fact, Stanford White died belonging to 50 clubs. But he didn't join the Century. He remembered what happened to Dad. A year after his father's death, he joined the Century, not too happily. But they got their jobs from the clubs. In the 1880s and 1890s, all the clients came from the clubs. He had to join. In 1887, he was persuaded to build the new purpose-built club, don't spend a lot of money, at a mid-block site on 44th Street, just above the city where it had been. And it was to be a big open clubhouse surrounded by other buildings on either side. It was to be built of brick and terracotta. It wasn't to cost a great deal of money. It had a central open porch, a central open doorway, was two sections of the building. The second section has a Palladian window in the middle, double flattened pilasters, and a balustrade across the top. I've always thought that it is one of many jokes Stanford White made. The grandest of the clubs in London is this one. It's a club started in 1699 by an Italian who sold coffee called Bianco. Quickly enough, he changed his name to the English translation and became Mr. White. The club is called White's. It is still the grandest of the clubs. The English upper class, White's. Initially, the bay window, which you see right above my finger here, initially that was an open arched door. It's about the same arrangement. It's mid-block, 2 floors, flattened pilasters, Palladian window in the middle, and that balustrade. What White did, I think, is say to himself, I'm going to design White's in memory of Dad, but nobody will ever know because I'm going to have Joe Wells Italianize it. And so up to his death, Wells was madly drawing all the Italian features on the building so that nobody would catch the reference that probably made Stanford White and his family giggle often. The firm went on to do a lot of clubs. A lot of great ones are still with us. The University and many other good clubs. But it wasn't clubs that really made Stanford White happy. What he loved was the evening entertainment. He belonged to all the clubs. The Players was his favorite because the Players was a club where they kept your private life discreetly quiet. He called the Century Club the cemetery. He thought it was dead. But what he loved was the Pleasure Palace built on the old car barns at Madison Square, which were too old and falling apart in a fire trap and had to be turned into Madison Square Garden. And White lobbied and demanded to be able to do the job and got the job in. It took 2 years to get enough businessmen ready to invest in the building, and he gave up. In the summer of 1887, the Paris Fair was on, and 1889, and he was on his way to Paris when he learned they were going ahead after all immediately. And so he wrote back to Joe Wells and said, do it up and do it up now and base it on a Spanish building. Why? Well, nobody in America knew much about Spain. So if you cop the ideas from Spain, few people are going to know. After all, Spain, not on our tourist route at the time, a darkest Catholic country. Even though, as anybody here may know, they found Boss Tweed pretty quickly in Spain. So his presumption was a bit naive. But what he does is take the Giralda in Spain and turn it into a palace where the first boxing matches are held, dog shows, horse shows, cabarets, vaudeville, dinner, drinks, all sorts of wonderful things. And how does he do it? He transforms the religious meaning of the Giralda Tower, which has a huge cross on the top to celebrate Catholicism over the Moors. What does he put up there? A naked lady spinning in the wind. And this palace, which becomes a home of nightlife in the summer to the city, has a great roof garden here, and the devices up here are another little Stanford White joke. He did a lot of little jokes. Those are ballflowers taken from the Vatican. So while you're drinking and kind of eyeing the chorus girls, you're being surrounded by forms that come from religious backgrounds. Oopsie, what did I do here? Oh, yeah. Just about this time, White and Wells, who had a kind of funny relationship, a little jealousy, a little problematic, and White went on his own to do a great Renaissance palace, and you could just imagine him saying, see, Joe Wells, I could do it just as well myself. And this is the wonderful Metropolitan Club on 60th Street, still very much with us, and perhaps one of Stanford White's best buildings. At this point, poor Joe Wells croaked. Around the corner from here, in what is Hedy Lamarr Hall, Paulette Goddard Hall, down the street here, and everybody suffered. The great architectural historians noticed that the quality of the work when Wells dies really begins to decline. This is the funeral and later concerts. That's Stanford White with a mustache. There's Wells's picture. But without Wells, things begin to change. McKim goes one way into high-minded architecture and professional studies. White gets caught up in the fast crowd of New York. In being at 5 parties on any one night, you'd come in and say, White was at the Philharmonic last night. No. He was at the opera. No, I saw him at vaudeville. No, he was at my party. He went everywhere. And when you see them in this picture, posed in a very unusual form, they're looking as if they're actually doing something together. They never did. This is Stanford White 20 years later. Boats are bigger. Europe is filled with stuff. He loves to shop. He loves anything that catches his visual imagination. This is a White interior. Hey, what happened to the Victor Newcomb House? It's filled with antiquities. It's filled with pretense. It's filled with a potted palm. It's where you would go to have a liveried footman stand behind every chair as you serve dinner. What you see here is a new life in a new world, a world that is very much caught up in the life of Europe. All the robber barons now could fill their houses with treasures. Where did they get them, and why did they get them? Well, treasures were as available as Bloomingdale's store is today. If you go to Paris, there were some dealers who went around when the railroad pushed through and knocked down a manoir. They bought the fireplaces, they bought the ceilings, they bought the fabrics. When the same thing happened in Spain, or you couldn't pay your taxes on the inheritance of your family property, you sold a fireplace, you sold tables, you sold stuff. And then there was Stefano Bardini. Stefano Bardini started out as a painter in Florence just when Florence was tearing down the core of the city, the entire medieval city. They were tearing down the monasteries, all the old palaces, the Jewish quarter, as Joy knows. And just as this is all happening, he had pickers go around in the afternoon to the demolition sites. You know that big square you go in Florence, that big useless Piazza della Repubblica? That was the core of Florence. What was in those houses? This stuff. What did he do? He bought a building, he bought a palace, painted the walls Bardini blue. It was a color that was meant to make gold look golder and white marble look better. And he sold everything in those houses to Liechtenstein, Jacques Marandre, St. Petersburg, the V&A, and Stanford White, who sent all his customers, so Mrs. Astor. So where does half the stuff in the American museums of medieval and Renaissance background come from? Stefano Bardini's rooms. Stanford White loved them until he found a man called Arthur Acton who underbid Stefano Bardini, but we won't get into that. You may recognize him. That's La Pietra. Stanford White could sell you and let you have everything. And this is his own personal house in Gramercy Park. Looks a little busy. Filled with stuff. Did Stanford White buy real stuff? Sometimes. Did Stefano Bardini have a little annex over near the Ognissanti where he made fakes for Stanford White because he knew he didn't know anything? So some of the stuff was good, some of the stuff was bad, but it all looked the part. And America, Gilded Age, go to the Flagler, go to any of the big estates. What do they look like? This stuff. And it's Stanford White who brought it to us. And in this, his last major house in New York City, the Payne Whitney House, still with us as the French Cultural Mission, in an interior ground lobby entrance area, he put a little figure that came out of Bardini's showroom on another pedestal and let water run around it. By the way, there was a flattened polar bear over here. But as he did this, he didn't much notice that this figure may or may not be, as was recently discovered or theorized by an art historian who teaches at NYU, this may be the lost, youthful work of Michelangelo. It is now, the little figure of the archer is now in the Metropolitan Museum, and a very nice quality replica is in the building. All righty, so Gilded Era, everything's changed. Boats can bring back anything. People go to Europe every summer. They bring back trunkfuls of gowns from Worth, paintings, ceilings, all sorts of stuff. What did the men do? What was the world like for married, middle-aged men at this time? Well, probably not too different from any of our congressmen. Pretty young girls from the countryside often would come to New York hoping that there they would find a handsome, frock-coated, silken-hatted young millionaire who would marry them. Didn't happen. Who did they find? Married men. What was this about? Well, it's about second lives of married men with young chorus girls who were often not so innocent either. They often thought that they might get a rich husband this way, an older one, but somebody who could afford their new glamour. One of these young women who sang in the Florodora chorus that you see on the far screen was Evelyn Nesbit of Pittsburg, shown here in a photograph by Kazabir in a kimono that Stanford White lent her. These young women had affairs with all the men of the day. It was not unusual. Most men threw the women out like old Kleenex. Stanford White did not. He was moral and took care of them, even after he tired of the young women. This is the opposite of Stanford White. This is Harry Kendall Thaw of Pittsburg, whose father was a very rich man. Harry K. Thaw was born with a major problem. Everybody knew it. His father's will read, "Don't give him money. He's dangerous." He had a very aggressive and unfortunately guilt-ridden mother who gave him $80,000 a year, $1906. He got in a lot of trouble. His specialty was whips and chains, but he liked injections of cocaine. He rubbed salt in the wounds. He was an equal opportunity sadist. He didn't care if it was boys or girls. He developed a fixation on Stanford White for probably some other reasons that had very little to do with White. He stalked him and went after all the girls, and one of the girls who was not kept by Stanford White was Miss Nesbit. He chased her, horrified her. Stanford White got her to a lawyer, got her to a doctor, helped her, but Thaw kept it up. He married her, and the two of them moved to Pittsburgh for a miserable year. In late June, just about this time of year, in 1906, Thaw decided to take his wife, to take Evelyn Nesbit to New York, see the sights. On the roof of Madison Square Garden was a brand new revue called Mamselle Champagne. That's a picture of it up there. As the tenor sang, "I could love a million girls," Evelyn Nesbit turned to her husband and said, "There goes Stanford White, the beast." And Thaw, who was wearing an overcoat, which is an odd thing to do at the end of June, bolted up and manfully and resourcefully went behind a potted palm. Under the coat was a gun. He shot White in the head, killing him instantly and covering him with black soot. There was a mild panic on the garden. Stanford White's own brother-in-law was at that particular performance, walked over White, having no idea who the victim was. The police caught Thaw. He went down there and inventively said he was a student from Washington, D.C. His name was Smith. Short on talent in lies. He then asked them to call Andrew Carnegie, call the Carnegie family, because his sister was married to a nephew. And they did. And Carnegie said, "Put the creep in the nut house or in the bug house where he belongs." But Mom Thaw rushed back, and in the best staged defense until O.J. Simpson, Mom Thaw put plays on Broadway where a great young, clean-cut American boy fights off the predators on his wife, none of which happened. He was a nut job. In any case, he got away with it and lived the rest of his life as a gentleman of leisure and wealth. What should that have done to McKim, Mead, and White? It should have killed him. But it didn't, because McKim was so erudite, so scholarly, so precise, so learned, and had Penn Station in his pocket, that he was able to give McKim, Mead, and White, as a firm, a different course which it struck. And for a while, they were the architects who produced the great buildings of America. Although perhaps derivative from European precedents, as they felt, as Theodore Roosevelt did, that America could walk softly and carry a big stick. We were the new country. We're the vigorous new country, ready to take all the achievements of Rome, Paris, and London here in America and lead it forward. And McKim, Mead, and White were the architects who could fashion the ambition of this nation. In 1925, modernism in Europe began. And as it did, the work of old-fashioned traditional architects like McKim, Mead, and White went out of favor. And everybody said they were only derivative builders, and their buildings went down. This is Penn Station, lying as it's on its way to become the foundations for the Jersey Meadowlands and to keep Jimmy Hoffa company. McKim, Mead, and White got written off as derivative architects incapable of their own design. What we can see when we see their work is that they transformed America from its simple beginnings of genuine kind of fun things we did in the summer in those wooden cottages, and then began to take ourselves seriously and marry our children off and give them really rotten lives, married to some Duke of Marlborough. But they were talented, and when they did it themselves, are good people in their office who would go on to become the whole next generation of great Americans and great American architects. We can see that their design was to put us into world context as an equal, as a learned, scholarly, gentlemanly player. Thank you all very much. Sure. Yeah, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to close this off so I can show them the other pictures I brought. Do you all have any questions? I'm going to show you something else while we're here.
Well, thank you very much. There certainly is some time for questions and answers that Mosette has graciously accepted. There are some microphones in the aisle if you would come up and pose your question so everyone else in the audience can hear. Please. Any questions?
Any questions? Joy, if anybody can find something there, you may. Oh, yes, sir. I would have liked, I actually have some Kim White, just what I'm doing now. Okay. To show you that indeed, Stanford White's first big college and its only successful college design was the Heights campus. It is a great complex. It's a great building, better than his partner McKim did at Columbia. I always think it's a wonderful set of buildings. Again, built for an impoverished school who only got Miss Gould laid along to do the Gould Library, but it's really terrific. It's really a great set of buildings. The idea of that Hall of Fame and some of the heads, if you all have been in Bobst and you see some of the heads sitting in Bobst cut off from something and you don't know where they came from the great Hall of Fame. When you would pay your tuition dollars to go to NYU Uptown and walk through the halls, you would see all these figures that say, yes, I can be a great sculptor, or I can be a great artist, or I can be a great writer. It's a brilliant bit of design, and that is Stanford White at its very best. And it is there. Bronx Community College is working by bits and pieces to make it function better. It's in quite good shape. Yep. They sure are. They became well, of course, sometimes I like to show the pictures of Leona Helmsley, which most of you can remember. They were 6 private houses. Mr. Villar didn't even get to live in them. He went bankrupt and was harassed loudly outside of his own creation, and he moved out, but the Reed family of Reed Hall, of Whitelaw Reed, some of you all may remember, went in there, and they functioned, and then they functioned as the Catholic Archdiocese headquarters of New York for many, many years. In the late 70s, the Roman Catholic Church recognized how clever it would be to redevelop the property, and in came Mrs. Helmsley, and it became the then Helmsley Palace Hotel. It is now the New York Palace Hotel. Regrettably, most everything's been ruined, but the Villar dining rooms, which are today a restaurant, what's that called, on the right side? Gilt? Okay, that's worth seeing. If you can, I don't think the interiors fit the building, but that could always be removed. It is. I'm going to show. I'm just flipping as I'm speaking with you. I'm just flipping. This is the office of McKim White. You can see how grand that was. Young lady. That's a wonderful question. He actually almost was. The relationship between White and Wells was a very difficult one. I think it was romantic in some ways. I think the problem was White tried to take all of the artists and bring them with him as he entered society. He loved the artists, but he loved society, and he was conflicted. And he couldn't make Wells do it. He could make St. Gaudens do it. He could make some of the other artists do it. But when he'd bring Wells to a club, Wells would embarrass him. So White decided that Wells may have had a lot of ability, but he didn't have the human characteristics to be an architect's partner. In late Christmas of 1889, there must have been a huge fight in the office. And Wells and White must have really gone at it in that tiny space. And Wells must have said, I'm tired of being poor and ill taken care of. I'm not a partner. Why should I keep doing this? And White walked out, and Wells walked out. And McKim didn't like that and didn't like conflict. And McKim went after Wells and brought him back and took him to dinner, and then wrote a letter to White and said, you know, we are not being fair to him. He's done so much work in this firm. We owe him so much. He can't live so badly. We must make him a partner. And so White rethought it and agreed. And in early January, they made him an offer of a partnership. And Wells turned to White and said, I wouldn't put my name on so much damn bad work, and walked out. And my guess is that what he thought was they would iron it out, they'd offer him the partnership again, etc. He lived right over here, as I was kidding before, in Paulette Goddard Hall, and unfortunately he got pneumonia, and he died, so there wasn't time. By the way, nursed, it would seem, by White. White sat there with him for 2 days as he died, but he probably would have been made. In the end, there were no more partners made until White's death. It's a good question. Thank you.
Are there lessons to be learned for today's architects, architect or otherwise, from McKim, Mead, and White, their story, their
Yeah, I think
there
there
are.
are. I think, well, thank you. That's a good question, too. I think there always are the people in the office who really do the work. And the principals are often the people who go get the clients, which is very important, too. What I think in their early days, they listened to the clients. I think that's the most important thing an architect can do, to care and to listen to your clients. Later on, it got a little too grand and a little too big, and McKim lost it for architecture, never really had it. I mean, lost it as a practitioner, got it for being a central figure, the dean of the profession. I think one thing we can learn from it by the end is when you get too famous, watch it. They certainly did too much, but they did train hundreds of the Dillon and Aldrich, Carrera and Hastings. You could just name all the next generation of great architects came out of that architect's office.
Mosette, thank you very, very much.
Thank you.